Good evening again. I'm Scott Beer. I'm one of two project coordinators for the J. Sherwood McGinnis Junior War, Peace, and Justice Project. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is really a journey, and a journey that we hope the community will take and continue to be with us as the months and years progress. It's been a labor of love, and it's also been a great sorrow. For those of you that were here a little bit earlier may have seen a slide with a photograph. That was our project director who helped conceive this project. That was Dr. Sherwood McGinnis, who was a long-time Foreign Service officer, a career Foreign Service officer. He was a faculty member of the U.S. Army War College, an adjunct professor at Dickinson College, and regrettably, he died prematurely in November of 2021. At a great loss to us. He was a dear friend, colleague, and neighbor. And many of you in the audience know Sherwood. He's here tonight, there's no doubt about it. And he'll be with us, and that's why we named it upon his death and his legacy. So thanks again for coming. So I'd like to, first of all, thank our host tonight in this wonderful facility, Todd Hall. Sean Gladden is with us, the Executive Director for the Cumberland County Historical Society. We've been blessed to hold several of our sessions here. It's a wonderful room, very intimate. So Sean, thank you again for hosting this event. Please keep apprised of what's happening with the Historical Society, because history does happen here. I like to think it's happening here tonight. And it continues to happen. There's wonderful events at the Historical Society. In fact, this year they've got a wonderful train exhibit, and James Kievit is back there, who's working this wonderful train exhibit with several other wonderful experts. So please visit that when it's complete, which will be when, James?
April 14th.
There you go, April 14th. Got that plug. I'd like to thank our partners in the project. That'd be Dickinson College, Penn State, Dickinson Law, the Historical Society, obviously, the Carlisle Chamber of Commerce, the Association of the U.S. Army, which is the Army's professional organization headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, the Joint Civil Military Interaction Network, which is headquartered in Georgia, and our participating organizations, the U.S. Army War College and the U.S. Peacekeeping Institute, also located and resident here in Carlisle. I'd like to thank our sponsor, that without them we wouldn't be able to do all of this, and that's Cor Christi Institute Incorporated. And I would just like to thank them and all our partners and our participating organizations for allowing us to get together tonight. Before I introduce our guest presenter, we all know that war comes at a terrible cost. And we just ended fairly recently the longest war in U.S. history, that being in Afghanistan in August of 2021, at a considerable cost. Over 7,000 U.S. servicemen and women were killed in that conflict. That includes Iraq as well. Over 55,000 veterans were severely wounded. Some 9,000 contractors were killed, more than actually active duty military, which is not usually publicized. And we shouldn't forget about the loss of life in the region that these conflicts occur. And it's estimated only that over 350,000 innocent civilians were killed between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan during those 20 years. And last but not least, the purpose of the War, Peace, and Justice Project is to illuminate the human conflict and its impact on society. And it does, as I just mentioned, does have a significant impact, and especially on our veterans and their families, but society writ large. And that's why we should be interested in the nature and also the consequences of war. Since 2004, 78,000 veterans have committed suicide. And in 2014 alone, there was on a daily rate of 20 veterans were committing suicide per day. And so these numbers are still way, way too high. In 1 year alone, there were more veterans committing suicide than were killed in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, we are engaged now in the current conflict in Ukraine. Fortunately, there are no boots on the ground, that being U.S. servicemen serving in Ukraine. As far as we know. We hope that continues in the future, but we also are praying for peace with justice in Ukraine and an end to that conflict. And every Thursday evening, tonight, notwithstanding, is the Ukraine Vigil that we sponsor at the old courthouse. So since the beginning of January, every Thursday evening from 5:30 to 8:30, you will see the Ukrainian flag being flown at the old courthouse in the front door, illuminated. There's a vase with peace lilies, a flag, and sunflowers that is also illuminated, and two banners. One says peace and justice for Ukraine. So again, we pray for an end to that conflict and a peaceful one with justice. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce now our guest presenter tonight, Dr. Tammy Biddle. And this is just a very short bio for Dr. Biddle. If you'd like to see her entire bio, please, by all means, go to our website because it is quite extensive because of her accomplishments. Dr. Biddle, Dr. Tammy Davis Biddle, retired from the U.S. Army War College in August 2021 as the Eliha Root Chair of Military Studies, the college's senior chair, and as a distinguished fellow at the college. Her research focus has been warfare in the 20th century, in particular, the history of air warfare. She has published articles and book chapters on civil-military relations, grand strategy, the law of war, and U.S. national security since World War II. Her book, Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare, The Evolution of British and American Ideas About Strategic Bombing, 1914 to 1945, published by the Princeton University Press in 2002, was a Choice Outstanding Academic title for 2002. She is currently writing Taking Command, the United States at War, 1941 to 45 for the Oxford University Press. She helped research and appeared in the 2020 BBC and PBS film Bombing Auschwitz. She has also appeared in several episodes of the television series Greatest Events of World War II in Color, which is hung on Netflix, and assisted with a new documentary on the 8th Air Force on Apple TV+. She has done podcasts for Strategy Bridge, Horns of a Dilemma, War Room, the U.S. Army War College, and others. Professor Biddle is a recipient of the U.S. Army Superior Civilian Service Award and many other awards from the U.S. Army for writing, teaching, and service. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tammy Biddle. Thank you, Tammy.
Of Sherwood's, and I had the highest regard for him, and I had great affection for him, and I do feel his presence here tonight. I'm really honored to be speaking in a symposium that is named for him. Don't look for the Apple TV show just yet. It hasn't arrived, but it will soon, I'm told. It's going to be basically a series that's going to try to replicate Band of Brothers, but for the air. And it's a Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg produced series, and there's also going to be a documentary that goes along with it that Mark Herzog is doing, and that should be very good. So something to look forward to. When Scott asked me if I wanted to participate in the symposium, I said yes, and he asked me what I'd like to do, and I said the Dresden raid. And I wanted to do it on the anniversary, so we're one day after the 78th anniversary of the raid. It's an extremely hard topic. It's going to raise questions tonight that have no easy answers. But that's what this symposium is for us as informed, interested citizens of a democratic society to wrestle with really hard problems regarding war and peace. So that's why I wanted to do Dresden and help inform you about it and help you share the journey that I've been on to try to understand this raid, and that journey's been decades long, trying to read everything I could about it, find documents, explore it from every angle, so that I could try to make sense of it. When you open the Pandora's box of war, you never know what's going to fly out. And one thing that we can say is that it will be unpredictable, and that it will bring to the fore a number of things like escalation, a psychological roller coaster, and many emotions, probably the predominant one being fear. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. The Dresden raid is important for many reasons. It came late in World War II, but I want to explain that for us, looking back on the event, it looks like it came late in the war. For the people who were living forward through the war, it probably looked a little bit different, and I'll explain that later. It was also a raid that was on a city that was considered to have great art and architecture. It had been a beautiful Baroque city. Many people had visited it in the 19th and early 20th century, 18th century as well. It was a famous, lovely city. And at the time it was attacked, it was full of refugees. So there are many reasons to think why this particular city. And I will be explaining that for you. Dresden is in many ways, and when we hear the word itself, it brings up a lot of emotion. And sometimes the word is used as a shortcut for all of strategic bombing. It's something that we debate constantly, still, but I think that debate is good and healthy, and it's what we ought to be doing as a society. And as I said, asking these hard questions is so important. But it is also something that, like many things in public memory, is now encrusted with myth and misconception, and not that many of us really know exactly what happened and why. And even when I thought I did, I still had an enormous amount to learn over the years that I've been looking at this very, very interesting event in World War II history. So let me see if I can get the technology going. That's a good start. This is a picture of Dresden from about 1905. As you can see, it's gorgeous architecture, beautiful wide streets and boulevards. It's an amazing place, and it still is. I hope you'll go and see it at some point. But it certainly has had a difficult history. Two other reasons why Dresden has, I think, stayed in public memory have to do with books that were written after the war. The first being David Irving's The Destruction of Dresden, which first appeared in 1963. And it had quite a reception. If you look at some of the titles of the reviews, they're quite hyperbolic. And Irving himself wrote it in this way, and he wanted to create an emotional impact for folks who were reading it. Perhaps the most problematical thing about the book was that it said that the death figure, it was sort of, with different iterations, and the book was published many times with new editions, the death toll went up and down, but it mostly went up, and it went up to 200,000, which was way higher than the actual figure. And that figure was based on Nazi propaganda, and Irving embraced it, and even after he knew better, he didn't really back away from very high death figures. So again, I think this was one of the things that planted in the minds of many people the idea that Dresden was somehow the most dramatic raid of the war. There are many reasons why you can be very troubled by Dresden, but it was not the most deadly raid. The other book appeared in 1969, and this was Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse Five. Obviously very different sort of book. Kurt Vonnegut had been a young man who had been drafted into World War II and found himself on the Western Front, was taken prisoner during the Battle of the Bulge, and then actually spent the time that Dresden was attacked. He was in the city as a prisoner of war, down in a cellar, but then he was required as a prisoner to help tend to the bodies after the battle, after the strike. And obviously this was quite traumatic for a young, imaginative, artistic man who really struggled with this event for a long time. And finally had thought about writing a book about it and tried and took years, but finally managed to, and it was published in 1969, and of course that is a very fraught year in the history of the United States. We were right in the middle of the Vietnam War, and this book, I think, spoke to a very skeptical generation of Americans. And I think this is another reason why Dresden has really got this high profile. But I will walk you through and help explain all the aspects of this story. But I wanted to raise these two books because I do think they did bring this book back into public memory and bring the debates back up to the forefront in ways that might not have happened if they had not been published. So my agenda is a little bit interesting. I'm going to start with the raid itself and talk through the tactics and the operations and help you understand why the raid was actually so effective as a raid that created a firestorm and destroyed a lot of the city of Dresden. I want to clear up some myths and misconceptions. I want to talk a little bit about the challenge of aerial bombing and why what we thought we were going to get in 1939 turned out to be something very, very different in 1945. I will then go back and tell you why Dresden was attacked specifically, why it came into the crosshairs at the moment that it did. And then I'll take a little bit of time to talk about the reaction, mostly the reaction at the time, but also a little bit longer term. So I'll be really speaking to Dresden's place in history throughout the talk. So this is a complicated slide, and I apologize for that. It's a bit of an eye chart. But I want to tell you a little bit about the raid. First of all, it's a four-part raid. The United States 8th Air Force was meant to go first, but it was delayed by weather, as was frequently the case. The weather is bad in Northern Europe. Any of you who've spent time there realize this. And so Bomber Command went first. And Bomber Command staged a two-part staggered raid over the city that started with the number 5 group, which was a very powerful force by 1945. When you talk about Bomber Command by 1945, this is an exceptionally powerful, destructive force that has been at war 6 years and has been training hard under a very difficult taskmaster, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris. And they can do a lot of damage. If things go right on the night, as it were, they can do a great deal of damage. But they are operating at this point at the high point of their level of sophistication. So on this raid, which started, the first phase was about 10 o'clock at night, and the second group came in a little bit after 1 in the morning. And that was starting on the 13th and into the morning of the 14th. And I'm going to go to a map in a minute, but I'll just talk through a little bit of this. First off, when Bomber Command went in over a city, it started off with what were called blind illuminator aircraft. They flew first. They located the city on H-2S radar. And they then dropped very powerful flares over the city to illuminate it, to basically light it up at night, so that the follow-on target marker aircraft could fly in and mark the place that Bomber Command wanted to hit in the city. And those, for the number 5 group, those target markers were flying Mosquitoes, and they flew in at very low level, if possible. This is something, Mosquitoes were phenomenal aircraft, and this is the sort of thing that they could do. And it turned out that they were able to fly down at very low level, and we're talking maybe 500 feet. And they were dropping their target indicators by eye, which again meant it was going to be very accurate if everything was going well. And on this particular night, things were going very well, and they came down 500, 400 feet and dropped in an extremely tight pattern right around the sports plots in the city. Also taking place at this point, there was a master bomber who was flying over the city in either a racetrack pattern or figure eights, and was constantly communicating with the oncoming bombers who were going to fly in after the target indicator aircraft had left. And they would be constantly in communication with the master bomber, and the master bomber would make adjustments throughout the raid to make sure that the bombs were landing as accurately as possible. Again, huge levels of sophistication. The second group, number 8 group, came in at about 120, and it was a similar pattern. They had blind illuminators first. Their target markers were actually Pathfinders flying Lancasters, so they were marking from medium altitude. So this isn't quite the same level of accuracy as the Mosquitoes, but it's still pretty accurate when things are going well. The Pathfinders are the most highly trained navigators and bombardiers and pilots in the RAF at this point, and they were good at what they did. And so 5 group and 8 group were rivals, and they were constantly working to get better and better. Then the next morning, it was the Americans' turn, and the 1st Air Division, parts of the 1st Air Division of the 8th Air Force flew in and attacked Dresden, the city of Dresden, at about noon on the 14th. And I guess that wasn't quite enough for this poor city, but another group from a couple of aircraft, and it's about 210 B-17s, could not reach their primary target, which was a synthetic oil facility, and they bombed Dresden as a secondary. So that was it's a sequence of 4 raids over 3 days. The intent from Bomber Command certainly was to do this staggered, very powerful raid that was meant to overwhelm the city's civic officials, civil defense, and also fire officers. So I've talked about the level of sophistication. One other thing to mention is that by this time the Western radar chain was moved back close to German territory. At the beginning of the war, as soon as you crossed the channel, you were under German radar. By now, because obviously D-Day had happened and it's 1945, that chain had moved back, and so it's a little bit less lethal to fly over Europe at this point for Allied aircraft. The flak over Dresden was light. A lot of the flak is it's not an acronym quite, but it's a shortening of the word Fliegerabwehrkanone, which basically means anti-aircraft in German. The flak was light because a couple of reasons. A lot of flak had gone to the eastern, flak guns had gone to the eastern front, and a lot of the Junkers guns had also gone to synthetic oil plants, which were considered crucially important. So cities were getting less protection than they had early in the war. And the attackers, again, using very sophisticated methods, were able to time their entry over the Ruhr at a moment when there was a fair amount of cloud cover to hide them as well as possible until they got fairly close to German territory. So let me see if I can get a little bit more on the sophistication of the raid and why it was successful. Not only do we have all the things that I just told you about with marking and all the indications, but we also have there are two raids going on. In the first phase, there's a raid on Dresden, which is here, but there's also a raid taking place simultaneously against the oil facility at Bohlen. That's to divide the German defenders and to make it more difficult for them to figure out what the actual main target is. There is also what's called a mandrel screen. These are Halifax aircraft that are carrying jamming technology, and they will basically jam any German electronics so that when the bombers emerge here and then here, they're coming from what's basically an electronic curtain. The Germans cannot see behind that curtain. So again, they're being protected as far into Germany as they can be. We're also seeing, these are feint raids. They're not totally feints. They are dropping some bombs, but they're not the main attack. Many of these are being flown by mosquitoes, and so we see other feints taking place here. And then there was another feint that broke off from the main Bohlen attack and dropped window, which are sheets of aluminum, which would show up on German radar as basically an air attack. It looks like a lot of aircraft on radar. So there are all kinds of things that Bomber Command is doing on this particular night to make this a successful raid for the folks going to Dresden, the pilots and the crews going to Dresden, not too successful for the people on the ground. But just to speak to the level of sophistication, I think is important. And the reason why Dresden became notorious and the reason why a firestorm started is because every single thing that happened on this night went well. I guess the only thing that didn't go so well was that there was a lot of cloud over Bohlen, so Bohlen was not attacked as accurately as Bomber Command would have liked. But every feint worked, the jamming worked, window worked. The Germans didn't know where the main attack was until very late. And that's why those mosquitoes were able to fly so low over the city and drop such a tight pattern. And those target indicator bombs are bright red. And so basically what they did was to define a bright red bullseye in the center of the old city of Dresden. And it was very easy for the follow-on bombers to see exactly where they were supposed to drop. And there was a great deal of sophistication in the way that they dropped bombs. They did it in a sector pattern, which meant that the initial bombs wouldn't get, the damage from the initial bombs and the smoke, et cetera, wouldn't obscure the follow-ons. So it was all very sophisticated. And again, it worked perfectly on this particular night. The weather was also cooperative. This was rare. It was very rare for things to go perfectly well. Any of you who have worked in military operations know there are 1,000 things that can go wrong, and usually some of them do. On this night for Bomber Command, basically nothing went wrong. So I've spoken to all of this. The first attack was really only about 25 minutes long, and the second about 35 minutes long. The second had more aircraft, about twice as many. But the real key to understanding Dresden was that first attack. And so this is just the second attack. This is the 1 o'clock, 1 a.m. This time, it's just a trip to Dresden. We don't have another major target. But you're seeing again the mandrel screen for radar, for electronic jamming. There's another window attack, and there are feints going on. When the second group got over the city, it was already very much on fire. What that tight concentration did was it meant that the first 200 and some Lancasters that dropped bombs were able to get on a very, very tight pattern. And when you get a tight pattern like that, and you're using both incendiaries and high explosive, you get a concentration that produced essentially, well, first of all, the high explosive breaks down all the material, the walls, the wood, everything that will burn, and also creates through drafts. And then the incendiaries land on everything that's flammable. And if they catch well, they start to merge, and the fires merge and merge, and ultimately you get a firestorm, which is basically a self-feeding fire. It's starting to pull in all the oxygen from the surrounding area. And that means it's pulling oxygen up out of shelters as well, and it's creating basically hurricane-force winds. So people who are in this environment are having to try to flee in a situation where embers are flying through the air. Everything that is combustible is igniting. It doesn't have to have fire touch it. The heat eventually becomes so high that you have spontaneous combustion. And also, the streets, any paved streets were starting to melt. They would get soft and people would actually get stuck or they'd lose their shoes. And so escaping was incredibly hard. Being in a shelter wasn't necessarily safe. Some people in shelters were okay, many were not. It depended on whether the oxygen was sucked out, whether smoke came down into the shelters, which it did. Carbon monoxide went into the shelters. That happened at times. So there were 1,000 ways to die on this night in Dresden, and it was really a hellscape. It was pretty horrific. When the second group got over the city, as I said, it was well ablaze, but this is 500 more bombers. The master bomber for the second group asked that the city be sky-marked. It was so smoky by this point, it was very hard to see the city, but Bomber Command could mark in the sky, it could drop flares that would hang in the air and outline the city so that the oncoming bombers could drop specifically onto the city and onto their target. As I said, with military events, everything is contingent. But again, everything went well. The light flak allowed the bombing, the mosquitoes to come down, and the Lancasters dropped down to as low as 15,000 feet, which is reasonably low for Lancasters. Steady westerly winds, and this is just, as I said, Bomber Command at its moment of greatest strength. Okay, so this is a pretty hard picture to look at, but this was the aftermath. We now know, after lots of debate and lots of toing and froing over the death toll, we know that from very careful study that it was about 25 to 30,000. With these kinds of things, we never know the exact number, partly because the city had refugees, so it's really hard to get an exact, accurate number, but it was about 25 to 30,000. Still, in a smaller city, that was a very daunting number, and this is the sort of thing that Kurt Vonnegut, as a young man, was confronting, trying to deal with these bodies. There was little refuge in the city. Of course, the municipal services had been overwhelmed. The hospitals were quickly overwhelmed. There were inadequate shelters, and part of this was that the Nazi officials in the city had prioritized those shelters for themselves, including Gauleiter Martin Lutschmann, who made a very elaborate shelter in his own personal space for himself. I mentioned the flak guns going elsewhere, mostly younger. So that's sort of the story of why this was a very effective raid tactically and operationally. Let me go back now and talk a little bit about strategic bombing and this question of why is it, we start out with expectations, pre-war expectations, and then end up with where we are in 1945. How could that have happened? When the war started, FDR called on all the combatants to not bomb civilians, not bomb unfortified cities. Of course, that depended on reciprocity, everybody sticking to the rules. Often in war, you know, you get past those early pledges because things happen that you don't expect, or your enemy behaves in a way that you find you have to respond to, and you start to see escalation going well beyond what one might have expected based on the pledges that were made by combatants early on, and also by the expectations that were set often by air forces themselves, particularly the United States Army Air Forces, which talked a lot about precision bombing and utilizing its Norden bomb sites to be able to bomb hitting a pickle barrel. I would say that if we use the Americans use the word precision bombing a lot, there's nothing in the Second World War that I think any of us would call precision by any dictionary definition of that term. It was basically misses were measured often in thousands of feet and fairly often in miles. So this was not such sophisticated stuff. So there's a little bit of a trajectory here. First, what we discover is it's much harder to find and hit your targets than people had expected. That's partly because there are effective enemy defenses. The Germans grab onto radar fairly quickly. They develop fighters, they develop flak guns, many other things. They would utilize decoys, so decoy fires were started outside of the city to try to pull Bomber Command off onto those other locations. The master bomber knew where the decoys were, and he would keep his planes on the correct target. Also, what we discovered as we went through this process was that first, obviously, the Brits start off, and they're really getting chewed up when they try to fly over enemy territory in daylight. German fighters and German defenses are very aggressive, and so this isn't going so well, so they have to switch early on to nighttime bombing. But obviously, at night, it's going to be difficult to find and hit anything other than a target that's very large. They try initially to hit industry and transportation targets, but in the summer of 1941, they find out that only 1 in 5 bombers is coming within 5 miles of its target. That was something called the Butt Report. It was a photo reconnaissance report that they studied in 1941. That meant they had to change tactics, and they then went to attacking cities. That was the one target that they could find and hit at night. Again, this was 1941. It's February 41. Britain, aside from the Empire, is fighting alone. Russia's not in the war yet. The United States is not in the war yet. This is very much an existential threat for the British. And even philosopher Michael Walzer says that this was a moment of what he calls supreme emergency for the British. So they were basically utilizing whatever they had to attack Germany and to try to denude Germany's strength. And the air raids were also one way of keeping home front morale up a little bit, because when you're being pummeled, as the Brits were starting in 1940, your populace will want you to do something back to the enemy. So that was part of what was going on. So once the Brits are flying at night, they are improving their tactics and their techniques, and again, by 1945, they're going to be very good at finding and hitting even very precise targets. We don't tend to think of Bomber Command as being a precision, and again, I'm using that term loosely, but an accurate bombing force. By 1944, 1945, under the right conditions, it was more accurate than the US Air Force. The Americans did not want to join in the night bombing attack. They were committed to a theory of long-range strategic bombing that saw the use of groups of high-altitude bombers, B-17s in this case, that would self-defend by using lots of machine guns mounted on those airplanes so that they would be able to fend off German attackers. That was the theory. And they would be able to locate targets in daylight with the Norden bomb sight. They wouldn't have to rely on going in at night and changing targets over to cities. So they were adamant that they were going to do this. And they tried very hard. Churchill and many folks in Bomber Command tried to encourage them to think about coming into the nighttime campaign in 1942. They resisted. They insisted on basically trying out their own theory of daylight self-defending, high-altitude daylight precision bombing, but it didn't go so well. So by August, October, the fall of 1943, when the Americans are flying deep into Germany, they're taking terrible losses. And the real kind of whack upside the head, if you will, was at Schweinfurt, where we waged 2 raids, very large raids against German ball bearings, which we thought was the keynote target. We were looking for that one card in the house of cards that if you pulled it out, the whole thing would come down. We were going for kind of industrial efficiency and keynote bottleneck targets, and we thought that ball bearings were it. But as you can see from the statistics, of the 288 bombers that reached Schweinfurt, 60 were shot down outright, 5 crashed in England, 122 were damaged, and 12 more had to be scrapped. And we lost 148 bombers in 6 days in October, which pretty much tells you that things are not going so well. Those are unsustainable loss rates. So we had to change tactics too. The first thing we did, starting in late 43, was to bring in escort fighters, which now had droppable auxiliary self-sealing tanks, which meant that the fighters could fly along with the bombers, go at the same speed, keep up, and fly long distance. Once they got over a target, jettison their auxiliary tanks and have enough aerial mobility to take on short-range German defenders. It was a wonderful innovation, and it really, in many ways, saved the strategic bombing campaign. But we also did something else. We started to bomb on instrument. We gave up on trying to make the Norden bomb site work in 10 tenths cloud. Basically, anything over 5 tenths cloud, you're going to have a lot of trouble. But we realized, finally, Americans took us a while, but we figured out that the weather over in Northern Europe is really bad. And so to keep the tempo up, we started using bombing. It was really blind bombing, but we didn't use that phrase. We called it bombing on instrument. So we were now attacking marshalling yards most of the time, but those are in cities. And we were taking increasing numbers of incendiaries to increase the collateral damage. This is, again, a vortex. War does this. When things don't go well, you find yourself in a different situation, you adapt. So much of the American and the British effort in the war had been, the eggs had been put in the bomber basket. And to go back and change that mid-war would have been very difficult, so we were searching for ways to make this effective. But the cost of making it more effective was to make it less accurate and to make it more horrific for civilians. So a little bit about how hard it was, and this is, if you watch the Apple Plus series, you'll start to understand this very quickly. This is tough stuff. Planes are, it's very difficult to do this. First of all, if you're flying in tight groups like the Americans were, you had to concentrate incredibly hard to hold distance. When flak guns are flying at you, or flak shell is flying at you, and fighters are diving in and out of, trying to dive in and break up your group. So you're trying to hold a position, and then when you get over the target, you've got to hold a position so the bombardier can do his thing accurately. It's terribly nerve-wracking, and it's incredibly hard, and the attrition rates are really high. So I showed you a couple of pictures down at the bottom. Often, the B-17 could take a lot of hits. It was a great airplane, and it could take a lot of damage and fly home. But sometimes when crews got home, they were flying into essentially a kind of pea soup. Britain was fired by coal in the 1940s, and if you combine fog and coal smoke, you get something really horrific that most of us have never seen in our lifetimes. It's very, very thick. And trying to find an airfield somewhere in East Anglia in this kind of weather could be incredibly, incredibly difficult. And so lots of crews crashed on land, attempting to land. And there were other hazards. The Germans are, of course, always trying to up their game as well. They came up with something in 1943 called Schrägemusik, which is an upward-firing cannon that they would mount on fighters, and they could slip in under Lancaster bombers in a way that the crews of those bombers could never detect, and then fire upward, and the plane would explode before anyone had any idea there was a fighter anywhere near you. So the Battle of Berlin, which was supposed to end the strategic bombing campaign because this was going to be Harris's big attempt to bring down the city of Berlin, did not go so well. It had very high attrition rates for crews, and it really didn't bring the results that Harris had hoped for. And this was coming right on the heels of the Schweinfurt raid, when the Americans were also deciding that things were not going very well for them. And so the rescue was going to be the fighters and just kind of biting the bullet and going in and fighting this battle of attrition. By 1944, this was incredibly important because D-Day was coming up. At Cairo, Tehran, the conference in November of 1943, Stalin and Roosevelt decided we were going to go and do a landing on the coast of France. Churchill had been dragging his heels. We'd gone to Sicily and Italy and into the Mediterranean, but both Stalin and FDR wanted to have a more direct campaign. And so now the time had come to truly defeat the Luftwaffe, because if you're going to do an amphibious operation, you've got to have air supremacy. And we didn't have it in early '44. So what this meant was an immense battle, and it was largely fought in the skies over Germany, and a lot of it was fought by the Americans, who were flying to targets in Germany that they knew the Germans felt compelled to defend. So it would bring fighters, draw fighters up into the skies, and then there would be these giant battles between American fighters and German fighters. But it was great attrition yet again. And it was so, I'll go to this slide. You're looking at these statistics and probably thinking, wow. And yes, it is very eye-opening. So, for instance, the Air Ministry decided it would do a study. Look at our crews. They have a requirement to do 30 missions, then they get a break, then they come back again, but they get a break after 30. Where are 100 people in Bomber Command, how many people in crews, where are they at the end of 30 missions? Well, what they discovered was that 16 of them were healthy, out of 100. 16 are healthy, 5 have been removed for wounds, 25 are in POW camps, and 54 are dead or missing. Those are terrible odds. For air supremacy, the fight for air supremacy before D-Day, the 8th lost a quarter of its heavy bombers in 1 month. And the Luftwaffe saw 100% turnover in its fighter aircraft and 40% turnover in its pilots. And that latter number is the real key, because you can't make up for that. You get on a downward spiral where you have to keep sending in younger and younger people or untrained people who are going up against veterans, and it's just kind of a death spiral. But that was the kind of attritional warfare that was taking place. We did, fortunately, by May, June, have air superiority over France, which was, it made D-Day possible. But if you were flying in the RAF or the USAAF in 1942 or 43, you had a 2 in 3 chance of being shot down and ending up either dead or in POW camp before you finished your complement of missions. So again, I'll sum it up by saying Hap Arnold, who was the chief of the Air Staff for the United States Army Air Forces, had 4 heart attacks in the course of the war. Basically, he was trying to make something work that had been structured on premises that turned out to be very faulty. And he had to change all of it in real time. And Portal and Harris had to change all of it in real time to give these bomber crews a chance of being successful. And again, because the Americans and the British didn't want to have to build a large standing army. We wanted to do this with aircraft. Going into the war, we thought this was going to be cleaner. It was going to be a precise way to fight a war. Obviously, that's really changed by 1944, 1945. But in the middle of this, we're seeing exhaustion, war weariness. We see wobbliness in the morale of air crews. In March of 1944, 52 air crew in the 8th Bomber, 8th Air Force flew to either Switzerland or Sweden and asked to be interned for the rest of the war so they would not have to fly anymore. And there were wobbly periods for Bomber Command, too. Okay, so now I'm going to go back further in time. I'm going to use a Billy Pilgrim thing and become unstuck in time, as Vonnegut would say. So now we're going to the 20s and the 30s, and I'm threading in more of the story here to tell you why there was so much fear and what led to the fear that ultimately led to the attack on Dresden. So if you know anything about Germany in the interwar years, it was a place where they were doing amazing science. Physics, chemistry, lots of initial atomic science was going on in Germany. The best physicists, mathematicians, chemists in the world were going to German universities. But when Hitler comes to power, all of that, or most of it, those who couldn't escape, many tried and many did, but not everyone, the rest were put in the service of the Nazi state. And that would, of course, lead to great trepidation amongst anybody on the Allied side. What are they going to produce? What weapons of war will they come up with in the course of the war? What's going to fly out of Pandora's box? And they had also done rocketry. So it wasn't just Americans and French, it was also Hermann Oberth in Germany, who was the mentor to Wernher von Braun, and people were doing this. There was also something that got a lot of attention in the 20s and 30s, and it really hooked the minds of lots of people and stayed. It was something called the death ray, which was meant to be a ray of electronic something or other. I never quite understood exactly how it worked technically, but it was going to be a powerful electronic beam that could stop engines and machinery in place. And there was a lot of talk about this. If you read the New York Times in the 1920s, you'll see a lot of talk about the death ray. So the death ray is out there, and people are afraid that the death ray is going to be something that the Germans might develop, that they might develop rockets, they might develop who knows what. And so this is a great level of fear that's for anyone who's in the intelligence side of things on the Allied side, and who understands German science and capability is worried about this. So we, the Allies, begin to see that this is in fact a problem. Wernher von Braun had selected a site on the Baltic coast at Peenemünde to develop basically what was going to become the world's first ballistic missile. And the German Air Force was also working on something called a flying bomb, which was a pilotless, it's basically the first cruise missile. So these were thought of by the Allies as secret weapons, and there was some indication that they were going to arrive because of basically intelligence reports that were coming out of neutral countries, and sometimes places like Poland would pass information when they could. Resistance soldiers would get information out to the Allies as best they could. There were lots of signs that this stuff was taking place. And by April of 1943, Churchill is told, and along with the British chiefs, that large rockets might descend on this country at any time with little or no warning, which is a pretty unnerving thing to be told when you're responsible for the civilian population. In August, Bomber Command had enough information about Peenemünde to be able to attack it, and it did so with fairly good results, not perfect, but fairly good, and it was enough to buy about 2 months, which proved to be an incredibly critical 2 months, because I'll explain in a moment, essentially V1s start landing in June of 44 and the V2s in September. So being able to buy that period of April and May and early June to get troops onto the continent was awfully crucial. Even after Peenemünde, it's not clear how much damage has been done or what else the Germans might come up with. So there's this just layer of great uneasiness. And in fact, when Churchill goes to the Cairo-Tehran conference in 43, he's going with 2 great worries. One is there's going to be a landing on France, which he's terribly afraid of. And he's a child of the First World War, of the trench warfare. He was an Easterner wanting to get out of the whole Western Front, move the war somewhere, the emphasis of the war somewhere else. He had seen Dunkirk. There were a lot of reasons why he was very nervous, and he had a small army. He didn't want to lose it. And he's also very, very worried about German rockets and German secret weapons in general. So that's what he's carrying around. And he goes to see Eisenhower after the conference ends. It's mid-December 1943. And he nearly dies. And I think part of this is frankly stress. He had a combination of pneumonia, advanced pneumonia, and severe heart arrhythmia that nearly killed him. His wife was called to North Africa, and Parliament was told he might not make it. And he was a tough guy, and he made it. But I think the stress on these people, on these individuals, was beyond imagining. So here's the psychological roller coaster. After we fight this terrible attrition battle in the skies to be able to land at Normandy, we then have a tough time breaking out. But then when we do break out, we move quickly, and things look really good for a while. July and August 44 look very good for the Allies, for the home team. And of course, landing at Normandy was hugely dramatic. Eisenhower writes the note saying, if it fails, it's my responsibility, which is an amazing note, and you should all read it. And if you teach at the War College, definitely show this to your students, because it's extraordinary. But once we break out, we've got Falaise Gap, you've got the liberation of Paris. Things look really good. So here's a, newspaper it's the Daily Express from mid-August 1944, and it looks like, we're moving to victory, and it's going to be over by Christmas, and things are going our way. But then they're not. And that happens in war. Things look good, and then they don't. So this is the flying bomb, and it was when it starts to land, and for the British, we don't remember this, but the British remember D-Day very differently. They were excited that the landing took place, it was successful, wonderful. A few days later, they're getting hit with V1s. So their experience is different from ours. By the end of June, 1,000 had been launched against the UK. They were getting good quickly at figuring out how to knock it down. We were using technology that had been developed at MIT and a variety of things, and fighters were able to go after them and kill them. So that was good, but it was still an onslaught, and a lot of people were finding this hard to deal with. Okay, so after the Brits learn how to deal with the cruise missiles, there's great excitement because it looks like maybe the weapons threat has been defeated. And in fact, Duncan Sands, who is in charge of coordinating all the agencies that are trying to defeat the V-weapons, has a large press conference on the 7th of September in 1944, and he says, we have defeated the V-weapon threat. And here's how we did it, and it was wonderful, and all these people cooperated, and the scientific and the boffins, and everybody was involved in this, and it was a great triumph. The very next day, V2s start landing in the UK. So this was probably the worst timed press conference in history, or at least that I know of. And so, you know, again, this roller coaster of up and down and up and down, and psychologically, this is what people are going through. And for R.V. Jones, in his really good book, says that Home Secretary Herbert Morrison is now in the Slough of Despond. Well, you can imagine why he's in the Slough of Despond. He cannot shoot down V2s. You cannot shoot them down. You can go after the landing sites, but they're mobile, they're hard to find. There is no protection against V2s. The only thing you can do is overrun the landing sites. Now, the British thought they were going to do that. That's a big part of what Arnhem was supposed to be about, Operation Market Garden. But those of you who know military history know that Arnhem failed. So Arnhem is the beginning of the downslope. And it's a big, fast, slippery downslope in the fall of 1944. After this high of the summer, there's a rapid. And oh, by the way, one other thing happens. Messerschmitt 262s, which are flying twice as fast as anything the Allies have, show up in July. So now we've got 3 secret weapons. We know, too, that Schnorkel submarines are operating. These are able to stay underwater for long periods of time. They're harder to track, etc. 4 secret weapons. We don't know what the next one is going to be, but there is constant, if you read the newspapers, there's constant speculation about secret weapons and what's already out there, what might be coming. There's a lot of speculation that could be an atomic bomb that the Germans might have developed. So that's what's going on. This is what the Slough of Despond looks like. And then, of course, the worst thing happens. At the end of all these other terrible things, Hitler goes back on the offensive, which in July and August of 44 looked impossible. And now he's back, and how could this have happened? And in January, New Year's Day, January 45, there's a big Luftwaffe attack on American and British airfields. And it's just not something that we had anticipated. And then we're not ready, we're out of position, we don't have enough troops, we get pretty well hammered. I think fully 10% of American casualties in the war come at the Battle of the Bulge. I think that's right. I don't know if that's Pacific and Europe, but it's a high percentage. And this scares the living daylights out of the Allies. How could this, you know, it's like we've nailed Hitler into a coffin and he's gotten out, like Houdini somehow. So again, this is where we are. Battle of the Bulge takes place in December, and the Russians have been sitting kind of on the outskirts of Warsaw, hoping that basically the Poles are going to rise up, fight the Germans, and then Russians will be able to walk in and have it easier. They're about to start their winter offensive, and that actually does kick off on the 12th of January. But there's a lot of fear out there, as I mentioned, and a lot of worry. And we are out of men, temporarily. We're out of men who can fight on the Western Front. That's why the 101st is having to do everything. But we've made some interesting strategic choices that I'm trying to explore in my book. But one is that we were training large numbers of men to fly and crew the B-29, and we've got 300,000 men back home producing it, but not enough trigger pullers on the Western Front during the Battle of the Bulge. Just another set of pictures, and this is the New York Times from, what day is this? December 20th, it looks like. December 20-something, a little bit blurry. Anyway, that's what's going on. Oh, and General Spaatz, writing back to General Arnold in response to this Luftwaffe air attack that had taken place, said, you know, if the Germans dig in behind their own, you know, their home lines, they could make this really difficult. And there might be another secret weapon. We can't rule it out. This was appearing in all the newspapers too, that kind of speculation. And he was afraid it might be the death ray. The death ray had not gone away. So here's the response of the Allies. This is from the Joint Intelligence Committee, which serves the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee in Britain. And they argued on the 16th of January that the probable worst-case scenario is that the Russian winter offensive and Allied spring offensive in the West might achieve no decisive success, thus forcing upon the Allies a renewal of the offensive in the West in about mid-August 45, coordinated with a major Russian summer offensive. This is obviously it's the worst case, but the military takes the worst case seriously. That's not good news. The British are war-weary. We're worried about what the next secret weapon might be. The Russian offensive has got to make progress because we can't help it on the ground. So what could we do? What are the options? So there's a follow-up paper by the same group, Joint Intelligence Subcommittee, report of the 25th of January, which is very important in the story of Dresden. It basically says, the Russian offensive is really important. It's going to determine the length of the war in the West. And the one thing that we can do to aid it is to use our strategic bombers to pummel the cities that the Germans need to utilize to move men and troops and material up to the front where the Russians are. So this is the language. A heavy flow of refugees from Berlin, the depth of winter coinciding with the trekking westward of a population fleeing from East Germany would be bound to create great confusion, interfere with the orderly movement of troops to the front, and hamper the German military and administrative machine. Okay. There are lots of refugees who are trying to move out of the way of the Russian offensive, and they're falling back onto cities in what we now think of as the eastern part of Germany. The intelligence folks are saying, look, if there's already going to be chaos in those cities. If we increase the chaos, it's going to make it really, really difficult for the Germans to get stuff where they need to get it. And so this is something that we could do with our bombers. Once those two JIC papers had circulated, a lot of the air leaders were thinking, okay, this makes sense. We can use strategic bombers this way. If this is going to help the Russian offensive, we will help the Russian offensive to get this war over with, because Britain is tired, running out of men, and the United States has got a whole other war to fight on the other side of the world, and we can't be still fighting in Europe in the summer of 45. We've got to turn our attention to finishing off Japan. So this is, again, what everyone's thinking. And so the air leaders say, okay, we'll start to think about this. But it really gets a kind of great prod by a civilian named Winston Churchill, who's getting ready to go to the Yalta Conference. And he says to his people, to the Secretary of State for Air, what are you planning on doing to these cities? I've read this report that just came from the JIC. What are your plans? And they send back, Bottomley sends back a pretty benign statement of, well, we're going to bomb the following cities. And Churchill's not happy with that. He wants something really aggressive and really big. And I think a couple of things are going on here. He wants to prove to Stalin that the Americans and the British have, in fact, made a very big contribution to the fight in Europe, and a lot of it's been through strategic bombing. And I think he wants to show the power of those forces as well. So he's thinking in political and military terms, but he's got an incentive to want to. And he's also afraid, obviously he wants to get the war over with too. So he says, I did not ask you last night about plans for harrying the German retreat from Breslau. On the contrary, I asked whether Berlin and no doubt other large cities in East Germany should now be considered especially attractive targets. Pray report to me what is going to be done. So that's like taking a whip to a racehorse, as Little Hart once said about that statement, pray report in the morning. And those of you who've been staff officers know what that means. It means you're going to be up all night trying to figure out how to make the senior leader happy, and in this case, the civilian senior leader. So Churchill really makes sure that this raid happens. I think the raid probably would have happened, but he really seals the fate of the city of Dresden at the very end of January. Okay, let me get my pointer out again, just to show you a little bit about use this pointer. This is Berlin. This is Dresden. This is Chemnitz. That's Leipzig, and that's Magdeburg. All these cities are important. The Russians are here, concentrated here, but basically here. The Americans are still back here. But the Germans, in order to fight the Russians, are going to be moving stuff in this direction. A lot of men, a lot of material to get the troops up to where they need to have the reinforcements to fight the Russians. They're all going to have to flow through these cities. And Dresden is a trunk route of east and west and north-south lines. And all these cities are important rail junctions. So they're all going to get hit. Dresden is simply, it's part of a series of raids. It's not a one-off. And in fact, of all the cities that were hit, I think Dresden had only the 10th or 14th most incendiaries dropped on it in February 45. And again, this is just contingency. It was all about that tight pattern from that first raid and the fact that everything went so perfectly that at 10 o'clock on the night of the 13th. That's a map from the New York Times. One of the things that David Irving would often say was that this was a suppressed story. The story of Dresden was never really told. And well, of course it was. It was in the newspapers. You could read all about it. But anyway, that was something that he would use as publicity. So basically, all this is in train now. Churchill has leaned in. The air staff guys are on board. We're starting to think, okay, what do we do? And it looks like, in addition to Berlin, Harris says, what about Leipzig, Chemnitz, Dresden? They're all railroad trunk routes. So let's hit those two. But the language here is really what's disturbing. And this is the thing that's really hard to figure out, and the puzzle about Dresden. So Chief of Bomber Command Arthur Harris was told that Portal is amenable to attacks on Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, Chemnitz, and, quote, any other cities where a severe blitz will not only cause confusion in the evacuation from the east, but will also hamper the movement of troops from the west. And then he's told, or the air leaders are told, exploit the confused conditions which are likely to exist in the above-mentioned cities during the successful Russian advance. And then finally, there's a new target priority list issued on January the 31st. So first is still synthetic oil, but second on the priority list is Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, and associated cities where a heavy attack will cause great confusion in civilian evacuation from the east and hamper movement of reinforcements from other fronts. If you translate that, it's pretty grim. Basically, refugees are being used as a lever. And that's one of the reasons why this raid is so searing. I think from everything I've explained to you about the levels of fear and the way that this is torquing up and accelerating and expanding and becoming more and more dramatic and more frightening, you can understand how this happens, but this language is troubling in terms of the way that we think of ourselves as fighters and as combatants. This is outside. We've got the gloves way off, and they're not even in the room anymore. They're so far off. These are the last constraints around strategic bombing that are falling away at this point. And on the 1st of February, General Spaatz read this directive to those gathered at the Allied Air Commanders Conference at Supreme Headquarters, SHAEF. So it's going to happen now. And in fact, on the 3rd of February, the city of Berlin was hit, the first of these cities to be hit. And it was a very big raid. And it was one of the few American raids where the target was designated openly center of the city. James Doolittle, who was commanding the 8th, did not like that. He felt that was moving away from what the Americans had at least tried to adhere to in terms of intent up to that point in the war. He pushed back. Spaatz said, "You're going to do it because the chiefs want this war over with." And Spaatz had pushed back against Eisenhower the year before in August, when there was a plan to hit Berlin in a similar way, and Spaatz said, that's not really what we do. And Eisenhower basically said, if the highest authorities say that's what they want, then you will do it. And that's how the military operates. It is under civilian control. Now, we can raise some questions about understanding and orders and so forth and so on, but this is still considered to be, at least in terms of use at Bellum, a just war. So and the escalation has happened naturally and very consistently over time. And I think we're just in a very, very interesting space, in a very interesting moment in the war, right in basically this period between the end of the Battle of the Bulge and March, when it becomes clear that Germany is a spent force. There will be no other secret weapon, and the end is coming quickly. But there was this moment when none of that was clear. So at Yalta, and of course Yalta is early February, the Berlin raid takes place while Yalta is going on. The Soviets on the 4th request Allied bombing of rail centers in eastern Germany to hinder the movement of troops and material up to the Russian front. These are very tired, often, and many, obviously, FDR is going to die just a few months later. Churchill has been battling health problems. Stalin's very tired. I think exhaustion feeds into this as well, to some extent. When you're tired and when you're exhausted and you're fearful, that's not a great combination. I think these guys were both. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is just what the Americans knew, which was the war in Japan was coming. In February, Iwo Jima would kick off. It would be brutal. In April, Okinawa would be fought. It would be even more brutal. And in addition to the Japanese fighting almost to the last man in these places, there was the problem of kamikazes also. So there was a very strong understanding of how hard this coming battle was going to be. And of course, in February, there's no knowledge of an atomic bomb. We don't know that it's going to work. Knowledge doesn't come till July. So again, very fraught moment in time. Okay, so Dresden takes place. Everything that I explained at the beginning of the talk transpires. And something interesting then happens. A British Air Commodore gives a press conference where he's trying to explain to reporters what is happening in these cities that are being attacked in Eastern Germany. And I think he gets into it, and I've read the transcript, and I think he gets halfway in and he realizes he's on very difficult ground. He's trying to, I think a lot of compartmentalizing had gone on. People were using phrases like cause confusion and inhibit movement of material and men up to the front. But the reporters were saying, well, wait a minute. You know, this sounds like terror bombing. You're attacking cities that have got refugees in them, and you're attacking, you know, with large numbers of aircraft and with incendiaries, and how, you know, have we gotten to the point where we're engaged in stuff that looks like stuff at least the Americans didn't think they were engaged in. Somehow, well, an AP reporter named Howard Cowan wrote a story about this, and it cleared the censors inexplicably. I don't know how it did, but it got through. It went back to the United States, and he said, basically, the Allied commanders have made the long-awaited decision to adopt deliberate terror bombing of German population centers as a ruthless expedient to hastening Hitler's doom. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't go down very well with air commanders in Washington who did not want this to be the perception of strategic bombing. And so there was a kind of instant attempt to do spin and to backpedal and say, no, 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 let's wait, everybody take a breath. But this was widely circulated in the US. Portions of the story were eventually picked up. It was suppressed in Britain. It was not published right away, so it was slower in the UK. And the story appeared on February 18th. So Hap Arnold calls Spots to account and says, you know, please send me your current operating directive and any further commentary you would wish to make on what you're doing over there. Spots was pretty incensed about that. He basically said, look, the chiefs, the combined chiefs of staff signed off on this. They wanted us to help aid the Russian offensive, which was a perfectly legitimate and wise thing to do at this point in the war. And oh, by the way, we did in these Eastern European cities the same thing, same tactics, same operations that we used in other cities in Germany. It just so happened that there were refugees there. Now that's the question. Did it just so happen? Or were they used as leverage? And if you look back at the language in the two JIC reports, it looks to me like it's leverage. And this is the unsettling thing. And this is why we're wrestling with this still. In 78 years later, we're still wrestling. So public responses. The London Times says on the 18th, brief article, German towns were bombed according to the dictates of military expediency. The article noted in its final sentence the fact that the city was crowded with refugees at the time of the attack was a coincidence. I can't read the documents and believe that it was a coincidence. On 19 February, the Washington Star ran an editorial that was wrestling with this whole debate. You know, have we become what we said we would never become? Are we doing what we said we'd never do? At the end of the day, they say, no, we aren't. The intent of the bombings was to hamper German transport and to force the diversion of the enemy's scarce supplies from the battlefronts to the civilian centers. And this, the authors concluded, is a harsh but legitimate objective of war. I also already mentioned that Spots was called on the carpet. His deputy for operations answered for him because when the request came in from Arnold, he was traveling in the Mediterranean. And Anderson said basically what I told you. It was the Russian offensive. We thought it was legitimate purpose, good purpose, and we were using the same tactics. So, you know, don't get your knickers in a twist about this. And interestingly, this coming from Hap Arnold was a little bit rich because he's putting huge pressure on Curtis LeMay to make the B-29s over Japan work, and it's his pressure that leads ultimately to the firebombing of 60 Japanese cities. So There was a little bit of tension between Spatz and Arnold at that point, and I'm told that Spatz was even considering resigning. He was so angry about it. And Secretary of War Henry Stimson also looked into this, asked for a report on Dresden, but he didn't press it very hard. We wanted to believe that we hadn't become the enemy we were fighting. But whether that was a kind of sleight of hand is the thing I've got to wrestle with as a scholar. So how do we explain this? Well, one thing I think is that when we're talking about war, we sometimes use euphemistic language that either allows us to compartmentalize what we're thinking and doing or buffers us from the moral implications of what we're doing. So the language that you saw in those two JIP reports was, language that is euphemistic, basically. But what was really going on here? Essentially, aerial bombing was going to create an obstruction between the advancing Russian troops and German resupply. But that obstruction was going to be, in part, human beings. Because the refugees is mostly old people and women and children. Again, this is what Kurt Vonnegut is, those are the bodies he's burying, and that's why he probably has PTSD. If you read Slaughterhouse 5 carefully, I can't diagnose PTSD, but it's a good case to be made if you read the book carefully. So we've got a stripping away of those last boundaries around aerial bombing. And the other thing I think that's important for us to understand is in war, as we're going through an escalatory cycle, it doesn't happen all at once. It happens iteratively. So every time you take a step, you run into a barrier, you can't do the kind of bombing you thought you could do, you have to make a change. You justify it in terms of military expediency or urgency, and then you do it again. And each time you're moving a little bit further away from your ideal or what your jus in bello principle of discrimination or proportionality is. But between 39 and 45, you actually cover a huge distance. It's just that it's happened in little iterative steps that were each justified in terms of the last step you just took. I think that's another thing that we need to think about in war. How both euphemistic language and incrementalism can get us someplace we didn't expect to go. So Churchill, this is cotton socks, decides that he's now, in March, is very nervous about the press attention, about what's being said about Dresden, and he's nervous about his own role in it. And so he decides he's going to now distance himself by putting out a minute that basically says, it seems to me the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. And then he went on to talk about wanton bombing, and as you can imagine, both Portal and Harris found this highly sanctimonious and galling. And they were pretty unhappy about it, and they made him withdraw that minute and replace it with something that had different language. But clearly, Churchill was worried. He was worried about how this was going to look, and he was a man who was very concerned about his image in history. Of course, he would go on to write a 6-volume autobiography, which he would modestly title The Second World War. So he's trying to retreat. Which sometimes military folks will say sometimes civilians will do that when it looks expedient, when it looks politically advantageous to retreat. But it's tougher for somebody like LeMay or Harris or Spatz. They're not so easily able to do that. And that's another thing we have to think about as a democratic society. If we ask our military to go and do things in extremis, do we then abandon them if they've done what we asked? So, some final thoughts. long wars, very intense wars, existential wars. Those of you who have taught the Peloponnesian War, I know there are some of you out there in the audience who have, they become very brutal. There is a brutalizing effect of warfare, and we need to understand that when we enter into a war, especially when the stakes are really high, as they were here. I think the fact that there was a lot of struggle over the language and over what we were doing at the end of the war was in fact a good thing. That signals a healthy society that is debating these kinds of things and is worrying about these kinds of things. And we can talk about this in the questions, which I'll start very soon, I promise. But again, I think the fact that Dresden has not sat so easily on our Western conscience is a good thing. It means we're paying attention to just war. We understand all of the problems that come along with it, how hard it is to hold on to and implement jus in bello, but there are reasons to think about doing so. Okay, so a little bit of good stuff at the end. The Frauenkirche in Dresden, a beautiful old church, originally built in 1743, had been left unrepaired throughout the Cold War. It was obviously in the old East Germany, so it wasn't rebuilt. It was a church. The East Germans didn't put high priority on it. But once Germany reunified, the people of the city decided that they should rebuild it. And in Britain, something called the Dresden Trust was established amongst British citizens, and they raised a great deal of money, something like £10 million, to help restore the structure. And this is the church right around 2004 when it was reconsecrated. At the very top, there is a cross and an orb, the top of the church, and that was created by a craftsman called the George MacDonald Company in London, and the lead craftsman, by coincidence, was the son of a pilot who had flown on the Dresden Ray. So this was an act of reconciliation, and I wanted to bring this to your attention because part of what this symposium was about is reconciliation and how we heal wounds and how we stitch things up after they've been ripped apart by war. I don't know if you paid attention to the little statement that was with the Eisenhower portrait, but it basically said, peace isn't just the absence of war, it means adhering to laws, it means living in a society that cares about justice. And that's, again, why I think this symposium is so important. This was these are the words of Bishop Joachim Wohl at the consecration, which was in October of 2004. A deep wound that has bled for so long can be healed. From hate and evil, a community of reconciliation can grow, which makes peace possible. And then finally, Dresden today. Extraordinary city once again. Humans have this incredible capacity to destroy things and then rebuild them. One of my favorite passages, these pictures, as I was finding them and putting them on a slide, it reminded me of one of my favorite passages from Slaughterhouse 5. The most powerful one, I think, where Billy Pilgrim is watching a film of strategic bombing. It's a World War II film. He's now finished. He's obviously finished the war. He's come home. He's watching this film. But it's going backwards. And so these bombers, which are flying backwards, are amazingly able to draw bombs right up into their belly and place them in neat rows on racks and fly back to the airfield where there's, with the bombs so they can't harm anyone. And these great long German tubes, these anti-aircraft guns, are sucking fragments out of the sky back into like a vacuum tube, pulling them down so they can't hurt the pilots or the crews on those airplanes. And it's such a powerful image because it's absurdist, but because it is, it makes you realize how crazy war is in a way. And then he talks about how all, like the bombs would be unloaded and then they would be taken and buried underground. They would be returned to their mineral state and put back in the earth. So anyway, I was thinking about that when I looked at the reconstruction of the city and the, sort of, it's not flying backwards, but it is the rebuilding of something that had been totally destroyed, because you obviously saw the first picture of what the city looked like. Okay, I would be happy to take questions. We're going till about 8:30, so anybody wants to. This is the hard part, because there are no easy answers here, but I'll do the best I can. Yes, sir.
A couple of questions. Going back to the February 13th, I think it was the night of the first raid, and I think you mentioned the RAF went in first at 10 p.m. and then 3 hours later the Americans.
Well, it was 3 hours later, the Brits a second time, the Americans the next morning.
Okay, now, who made the decision to send them in, both the Brits and the Americans, whose responsibility was it to make that decision? And the second part of the question is, where did the bombers come from? Were they from airfields in Britain or France or where?
Yeah, they were from airfields in Britain. The responsibility for that decision would have been the most senior airman in the theater, and also the chief of air staff, who was Sir Charles Portal, who would have been very much in the loop with the Joint Intelligence Committee reports and would have seen those immediately. At this moment, Arnold was down with his fourth heart attack, so he was kind of out of commission. So it was really Spots and the people around Spots, and also Eisenhower's deputy, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, who would have been in on this decision. So it was Harris, Portal, Spots, and Tedder. And Eisenhower, because Eisenhower was head of SHAEF at this point, all would have decided that they wanted to follow the advice that had been given in the Joint Intelligence Committee report and utilize bombers in this way. So at that, it would have passed fairly quickly to Sir Arthur Harris, who would have come up with the operational plans. His people at Bomber Command at High Wycombe would have decided how to wage that war, that campaign, or that one raid, but also all the city raids that I've talked about. And the Americans would have decided, it would have been Spots, and then Doolittle, of course, who was in command of the 8th Air Force. So all those people would have been in the loop and deciding. And of course, Bomber Command was flying, they were mostly flying out of East Anglia and Lincolnshire, the sort of flat eastern parts. Obviously, it's sensible to be on the eastern part of the UK. And it tends to be very flat, so it's good terrain for airfields. So that's where they were flying from.
Hey, Tammy, you mentioned 30 missions.
Yeah.
How long a period would that be for an air crew? How many months?
Yeah, it would vary, Mike, depending on the weather. So it was actually 25 when the Americans start, and then it goes up. And the Americans are in a good position, because if they can complete their 25 and then ultimately their 30, they can go home and train new air crew. The Brits couldn't. They got time off, but they had to come back. And then this was right around 44 when Spots decided, okay, we've probably got enough air crew in the system right now. And even though it's still really hard, it's not as hard as it was in 42, 43, so we're going to extend these missions and make people essentially fly more missions. So the guys who were stuck, with the number constantly going up, they'd meet the number and then it would go up again. Those were some of the guys, I think, who were getting really poor morale. But it could go, so for, let's say, an American crew, it could be a matter of months. But if it was prior to autumn of 43, when we were not flying on instrument, It could be many months, it could be half a year, it could be, a good long time. But it really depended on where you came in, what the weather was like, and what the requirements were. Were you able to fly blind missions or not fly blind missions? If you could fly blind, you could go fast, because you could get those missions over with faster.
Yeah, thank you for a really great presentation.
Thank you.
As you're doing your presentation, I couldn't help but think about a parallel, or not quite the analogy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that faced the end of the war.
Yeah.
Did that kind of memory of Dresden not factor into the decision in Japan, or was it just the way the winds of the war that hastened that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Kevin. I mentioned that right about this time, the decision was being taken to switch, because in Japan, the jet stream winds plus cloud cover had made the precision bombing that we attempted to do initially pretty much impossible. It was kind of the same story as in Europe. And we, at this point, switched over to incendiary bombing, low-level incendiary bombing of Japanese cities. I think it's part of the same story. It's a desire to get the war over with as quickly as possible, and in this Japanese scenario, to not have to land troops on the home islands. It's incredibly brutal, but that's what we're talking about at Dresden too. I think in the Far East, the way that it's written about and the fact that there's very little debate over the ethics of it speaks to some degree to the racism that's going on with the way we think about the war in Japan. But I don't want to take that too far, because I think honestly, if the Germans had won the war on the Eastern Front and had defeated the Russians, I'm not sure we would not have used atomic bombs on Germany. But I do think, clearly what was going on in the Far East was paralleling this kind of vortex of escalation and brutality that had happened at the very end of the war in Europe. But it was going on without as much comment. And in fact, when the war is won and Hap Arnold writes the final report that's written for the public of how the Army Air Forces operated in the Far East, it's very triumphalist. And he does not apologize at all for firebombing or the atomic bombs. Yeah.
Yeah, one question. I know you've given presentations before, but I think in previous presentations, you mentioned that the loss of life in the Hanover raids was bigger than the
Hamburg, yeah.
Than what was at Dresden, which was kind of, that was, several months before.
It was in 43, yeah.
I think as your piece that you gave tonight, it was really kind of like a perfect storm coming together between the defenses and everything else. But going back to the gentleman's question in the front row, I think the question he was really trying to ask you is, if the first blade through and the air boss is up there is so successful, why have 2, 3, and 4 behind it and not wait them off and go to the ultimate target, or just keep them coming because that's the plan, and you don't know the plan because of the command structure between making those kinds of decisions in the air boss, what do you want to call that guy up there, for the mission, to say, okay, we don't need a second or third, convert that to, because they all have backup cities, I'm sure, even for the division, in case the thing got caught and stuff. To me, that's the real question. If you're looking at it from the air, obviously it's been pretty successful. So why go back and continue to hammer the next day? It's probably a more disturbing question. Because someone will know that they were doing air recce as far as BDA, bomb assessment, figure how well they did what they did.
Yeah. These plans were orchestrated pretty carefully, and so things like the bomb loads, but also the fuel loads would be calculated in a particular way. So it was certainly the case that crews, especially American crews, that could not strike a target visually or use a bomb site, could go to a secondary target and drop their bombs. That was a little less common for Bomber Command. They could, I think, go to secondaries, but again, this stuff is really deeply orchestrated. So for a master bomber to say, okay, I want you guys to, never mind, we're not going to send you, you're going to go to a different place. That would have been really unusual and probably a little bit too chaotic. Master bombers they had a lot of power and they could do a lot of things, but I think trying to divert 500 Lancasters to a totally different target would have been a thing that they wouldn't have done on the spur of the moment. Did I miss it? Okay, John, and then I see you keeping track.
Yeah, Tammy, to partly answer that gentleman's question, can you talk a little bit about, you did this a little bit, but the casualty rates among these guys? My understanding is that the casualty rates approach that of infantrymen in ground combat, and it's really anything that increases the risk that you're going to lose more of these guys is simply unthinkable, given the damage that's being done, and they almost broke.
Right, and I think, John, that again, all the stuff that I showed, when I showed those two maps, and they're air historical branch maps, they are original maps from World War II of the Dresden raid. All those feints, all that stuff is calculated to protect crews. And to make a call kind of last minute and you wouldn't want to do that. Arthur Harris and his deputy would not have been real thrilled about an air boss. I mean, he had limited authority over the city he was in charge of, but I don't think he would have sent them to a different location. But crews, as I said, crews who really could not find a target, American crews who really wanted to bomb with a bomb site, couldn't do it, were authorized to go to an alternate city. But they were all authorized to go to very specific alternate cities because that would have been within the range. It would have been, still calculated and orchestrated in a way that would have been safe for them and would have made sense for them in terms of the route they had already flown so far. That's why, again, Dresden is hit as a secondary on the 15th because the synthetic oil, I think it's Ruisberg or something like that, they couldn't find it. There was some of the crews on the way to Dresden in the first round, the 8th Air Force lost their way and hit Prague instead of Dresden. Hitting the wrong city was not uncommon. I mean, even as late as this is how weird strategic bombing was in the war. I mean, it could be so incredibly precise like the Dresden raid was because it all fell into place. And then you could have navigators lose their way and end up bombing the wrong city. We bombed Switzerland a bunch of times. It turned out that probably wasn't so unwise because the Swiss were bankrolling the Nazis, but we didn't mean to bomb Switzerland. Okay, yes, ma'am, in the back?
This is Carrie.
Oh, hi, Carrie.
Hi.
My eyes weren't, I needed a new pair of glasses.
No, I got glasses because I finally spent enough time staring at the computer screen and my email. But, so what continues to fascinate and trouble me about this period of time is the dramatic switch in doctrine and objectives that happens immediately after Dresden in the 4 to 6 weeks post-Dresden. Americans appear to double down on the area bombing offensive and the idea of bombing of cities. The firebombing of Tokyo happens 9-10 March, less than a month after Dresden, when all of this is appearing in the press, and there should be massive public blowback, right, to the Americans. And yet they seem to be doubling down on this idea that, no, we are bombing cities and we are, terrorizing the population and going after civilians. Whereas Winston Churchill appears to draw back significantly in his support for the area offensive immediately after Dresden, even as it slowly leaks into the British press, right? And that memo that you cite, it goes on to say, right, we shall not, for instance, be able to get housing materials out of Germany for our own needs because some temporary provision would have to be made for the Germans themselves. And so he's very clearly looking forward to reconstruction of Germany and home front, and there's non-ethical, very kind of utilitarian reasons, it seems, why Churchill is thinking this way. So I guess my question to you is, how do you explain the divergence in doctrine and divergence in comfort level with the area offensive and the bombing of civilians that seems to happen at this moment in Dresden between the British, who previously were very comfortable with bombing cities, and the Americans, who seem to go over to that side while the British pull back.
Arthur Harris is never apologetic. He lives on for many years and never really apologizes for the way that he fought, because his argument always was, it was better than trench warfare. It was better than, you know, what might have happened if again, he's a World War I veteran, so he's thinking very much in terms of the contrast between the First World War and the Second World War. The interesting thing about the public debate is that there isn't that much pushback. I mentioned that Henry Stimson looks into it, but he kind of drops it. The Cowan story goes out, but the editorial writers say, well, this is unsettling, but I think, you know, the Air Force is reassuring us that you know, we still do care about these things. But as you point out, in the Far East, it was a different story, and we were really escalating at that point. There wasn't a lot of public pushback. Fairly soon after this, I mean, Yalta is dominating the headlines, the war in the Philippines are in the headlines. There's a lot going on, and by March, when we realize it's kind of over with, but we haven't finished in Japan, and all these American boys are now transferring out of Europe and getting ready to go to Japan. So all those parents and all those wives and sisters and brothers are thinking, let's get this thing over with before my dad or my husband or whoever has got to go fight. Interesting case for me, because my dad had fought in Western Front but didn't have enough points, and he was being transferred to the Far East, and he found out later he would have been, I think, in the second wave. But anyway, the public was pretty accepting. And what's kind of astonishing to me is how accepting they were of what was going on in the Far East. You know, and I think it's partly that this is it's viewed at this point as an existential fight. It's not really. I mean, at that point, the Japanese were not an existential threat to the Americans, but it had torqued up so much in this kind of Clausewitzian spiral that it was horrific. And, you know, another Clausewitzian quote, 2 wrestlers can get themselves into positions that no single individual could ever manage. That's where the war was, and I think the public was largely okay with that. And that's another thing that's, you know, makes me realize when I try to write about this history, I've got to get myself into the heads of these people. It's hard to do, but I have an obligation to try to understand what my grandma was thinking. She had 2 sons still fighting in the war, and imagine she was rooting for, you know, it's a heavy bombing. I can't say that for sure, but I think this is, you're right, this is what's so troubling in terms of this debate at this moment in time. Why wasn't there more public pushback? And why? I mean, the first time I read Hap Arnold's report on the war in the Far East, I just couldn't believe it. He was very excited and very happy to tell the American people how many Japanese cities had been burned down. And in fact, there's a map, and it's got every single one, and right next to it, there's a graphic that shows an American city of roughly the same size, just so you'll know, Americans, how many people were involved and how many cities were involved, and it's breathtaking. So I know these folks are in a very different space than I am looking back at it now, 70 years later, as a historian in a comfortable office in my home, which is kind of my kitchen, but kitchen or dining room. Yeah, I take your point. It's daunting. I have to, because you've spoken, I've got to go one behind you, and then I'll come back to you.
Just a quick point of clarification. I believe you said that there were, what, 52 air crews that flew to Sweden and Switzerland?
Yeah.
Were they given asylum, or,
Yeah, they were.
and what happened to them afterwards?
Well, I don't know. I imagine they were not, their organizations were not thrilled.
I mean, I've read a
Because
lot
they
about
took the
war,
airplanes
but I
with them,
never- yeah, but
and, and they're trained crews, and that's a big loss. I have to look into that. I just came across that statistic recently when I was trying to look at morale, particularly in the lead up to D-Day. So I need to follow that up. It's really interesting.
I wouldn't be surprised, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, sir, and then I'll come back.
Well, Dr. Vice President, let me first tell you that I'm very impressed by your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm not only a scholar, but I've been an activist to bring down the Iron Curtain. And therefore, nowadays, when we promote political correctness, such lectures are not so widespread. You not only presented a very well-founded perception of the Dresden case, but in the complexity of World War II. And I grew up in that time. And I grew up in a family where some were sent to concentration camp, and some later to Gulag. And we had the great expectation that the Americans will make us free. And we thought that Dresden was not so bad. However, 2 people of our family died in Dresden. And they were escaping from Silesia to a free world. Now in the whole context, the politicians, what they found out, their own perceptions and interpretations. The Russians were only 40 kilometers from Berlin. The Americans were the other side. Why did we attack cities? And we know by definition what it means. Weapons, military against civil population. It's good, it is war crime. We don't define it. We try to interpret it again in different ways. That's the legal, that's the moral. And this came up here in the questions. How it was handled. Does the goal sanctify the means? And it did. And therefore my final question is, how can we bring this to the attention to our decision makers, but not to repeat it? And we did, Afghanistan's arm. And I've been dealing with some journalists like General Raune, who dealt with the SALT 103, and he told me, very often we don't think in moral and legal terms, we think who will dominate. And my question is, do you agree with this, that the Allies, by fast and nefas, wanted to dominate and terrorize the public, and virtually every city was treated like Dresden. I grew up in a small city, there was no military, but we were bombed. And nearby, when farmers were on the farm, from the airplane they were shooting them. So my question is, how can we bring it to the attention of politicians from the academic perspective? Because more and more academicians are politically correct. They're not pursuing what we're supposed to do. So what would you recommend?
I think at the end of the war, we are in a world where its ends are justifying the means at some level. We're trying to get the war over with as quickly as possible. That's going to be debated probably forever. The problem with getting into that kind of ethics is that once you move in that direction and you move to a place where you're violating principles that you want to uphold in terms of jus in bello, proportionality, discrimination, can you come back? Can you come back from that and be in good conscience and be the people that you want to be, and still hold the trust of your own public, still hold the trust of your allies? These are the questions that I would debate with my students when I was teaching at the War College constantly. And they would say, well, what if the enemy is so horrible? Aren't we justified in fighting them the same way? Or, and I would say, be careful. I understand the impulse. I understand how you're thinking about this. But if you go to that dark side, can you come back? And at what point do you become the enemy you're fighting? Because at that point, there is no distinction between good and evil if you don't hold the moral high ground, or you don't try to hold the moral high ground. The problem with all of this, and the problem with trying to figure out how do you even think through law of war, is between the wars, there's no clear law on who's a combatant and who isn't a combatant. If they're contributing to the war economy, are they a non-combatant? They're going into a factory that's making munitions? None of that is sorted out. At Nuremberg, basically Telford Taylor said, look, we engaged in the destruction of cities, of destroying, and we did it far more extensively than the Germans, but the Germans were doing it too, Coventry, Rotterdam, other places. So we had no grounds to prosecute them on that. We avoided that subject. There was no reason to take the trial there. I'm sure probably somewhere along the line, someone in defense, because they all had defense attorneys, would have said, well, what about your strategic bombing? And I'm sure the justices said, we're not talking about that subject. We're talking about other subjects. But it's a pertinent question. I think what we need to do as informed citizens of a democracy is pay attention to what goes on when we make decisions about going to war or not going to war, and then once a war starts, how are we prosecuting it? Don't believe that because you're just a citizen, you're back home and you're not on the battlefield, that you can't have a voice. We want to hold our leaders to account for what they're doing. And, you know, if the military is serving the political, civilian political leadership. So we have a voice through our representatives and through our entire structure of our democracy to be able to say, this is what we want, this is what we believe in as Americans. I know when wars start, our moral environment starts to change. It really does. And I am realistic enough to know that the way that people will talk about warfare in the abstract is very different than the way they talk about it once they're in, or the way that my grandmother would have talked about it when her two sons were in it. So we've got to factor that into our conversations and our debates and our discussions. But I still never let my students off the hook with respect to principle and jus in bello, jus ad bellum, because I didn't want them to become the enemy. I wanted them to be, the last thing I would say to every class I taught at the War College was, see you on the high ground, which meant don't ever abandon principle. Don't ever, you know, as hard as it may be, try to hold on to principles of jus in bello, jus ad bellum. And that's important for the psychology of individual soldiers, too. They want to believe that they have done things that were legitimate and that were sanctioned by their people. And we have an obligation to protect the mental health of the people we send to fight. So there are all kinds of reasons to hold on to this stuff.
Dr. Biddle, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. And we're bringing a lot of these sessions back, so Tammy, please stay tuned for a return visit. And then
Well, I'm going to try to talk my husband into being the next Biddle.
I know the night's been long, but the wisdom attained tonight, this is my second time through the session. Yesterday was our first session, and it's incredible. Thank you for the insight. Very, very quickly, we talk about the potential damage to the psyche, soul, and of course the physical wounds of our veterans. This is a theme that we're developing, especially this year. So please follow that. One of the ethical foundations for the project is we use Leo Tolstoy's quote from The Kingdom of God is Within You, and he says, the recognition that the life of man is sacred is the first and only basis of all ethics. And for me, foundationally, war is about moving from the profane to the sacred. And how do we do that? And it's awful darn tough at a great cost. And that's why we have to understand the profession of war and also the end state of war, which Liddell Hart, Aristotle would say the purpose of war is to achieve a better peace. And frankly, we were not doing well at that. I think Tammy would probably recommend the Dresden book is by Frederick Taylor. Would that be a...
There are
Good.
two. The Frederick Taylor book is great, but there's also another one it's a series of essays. It's called Firestorm, and the editors are Paul Addison and Jeremy Krang from the University of Edinburgh. There's another book called Firestorm that is not good, so I'm not sure. Make sure you're getting the Addison and Krang, but it's quite good. But also Frederick Taylor.
I have another book to recommend. Tom Roston, who writes for the New York Times and New York Magazine, wrote a very fine book on Kurt Vonnegut last year. The title is The Writer's Crusade, and it's about the thesis question, underlying thesis question is, did Kurt Vonnegut suffer from post-traumatic stress? And he interviews the family members, surviving family members, I think a son, and I think the answer is probably yes, based on what he went through. What I find fascinating about the book, Roston dedicates 2 books to post-traumatic stress and moral injury. And to me, that's a worthwhile read in itself. Last but not least, I'd like to advertise some future events. We're slowly developing the schedule for this year. But next month, we hope to have the presence of Professor Dermot Groom from Penn State Dickinson Law. Professor Groom was the lead prosecuting attorney against General Mladic for the Srebrenica massacre. He also wrote the charges against Slobodan Milosevic. And we're blessed in this incredible community to have this intellectual power across the socio-economic spectrum. And this is just one evidence tonight of that. And so hopefully Professor Groom will join us in March. And the subtitle is The Universal Jurisdiction. He's going to talk about war crimes. So this tonight was a great segue, a great question and statement, and because he'll talk about what's happening in Ukraine. And he recently returned from Ukraine investigating war crimes. And so please follow our website, warpeacejustice.org. And if you've signed up for our email announcement list, which is in the back, if you haven't signed up where the bar is, you can sign up. Your email address will blind copy you and with our next event, and we hope again to do that in March. So please join us. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much. Thanks for